Hey there, students. How about another art history lecture? This one is brought to you by my friends at Fiveable, who have helped me out recording this video. Check out fiveable.me for more information if you're studying for the AP European History exam or a number of other exams. So we're going to be looking at Mannerism, the art of the late Renaissance, okay? Now, the thing is we typically think about Renaissance art, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo's David, the School of Athens, Da Vinci's Last Supper. That's really what we think of as like the high point of Renaissance art, which is during the High Renaissance. Just like the Middle Ages, the Renaissance is divided into the early Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and the late Renaissance. Now, of course, this whole idea of the High Renaissance really brings us to the point, it would be, just middle Renaissance if they weren't trying to say this was the pinnacle. And so Mannerism is late Renaissance art. And just for a little bit of historical context, what is the High Renaissance? The High Renaissance was that period between 1490 and 1527. Now, 1527, that's an odd date, isn't it? So what happened there? Well, the sack of Rome happened. And while we tend to know about the sack of Rome in the 5th century AD, several sacks of Rome by barbarians, we don't realize that Rome was sacked by Christians, actually, here during the Renaissance, by the army of Charles V, who was a devout Catholic. Well, what happened here is even though Charles V was a devout Catholic, he was the most powerful man in Europe, and the Pope thought, it would be a great idea is if we got everyone together, the League of Cognac, he called it, which of course includes the French, and several Italian city-states and the papacy, and they thought it'd be great if we could get Charles V out of northern Italy. And that was his goal. Big mistake. Okay, so Charles V's army defeated the French in northern Italy, and then because they hadn't been paid what they were expecting to be paid, they forced their commander to let them march on Rome. And when they got to Rome, they looted the place, just pillaged the mess out of it. And Rome went from 50,000 inhabitants to about 10,000 inhabitants, with several thousand people killed. And this was the end of the High Renaissance, okay? Because really, if you think about it, the papacy was one of the biggest patrons of the arts. So when something like this happens to Rome and the prestige of the papacy, we're not going to see the same things happening after that. Now, the other thing is that it's difficult to pretend that the world is beautiful and we want to paint all kinds of idealized philosophers. So as far as where Mannerism falls in, it falls in between the High Renaissance and the Baroque. The Baroque is going to become the dominant art form in the 17th century. Now, we'll start to see in late Mannerism some characteristics of the Baroque. So it's a bit of a transitional phase, and it's Renaissance art. To be clear, it is Renaissance art, but it is different enough to warrant its own classification, kind of like other people who listen to metal, and you think about all the different subcategories of metal, where to just the average person it all sounds the same, right? Just a bunch of loud guitars and screaming. But to a connoisseur, to an aficionado, this is something that people can see, all of these different styles. So when you think about Mannerism, late Renaissance art that is different enough to warrant a subclassification. Another thing to note here is that Mannerism was coming around in the early 1520s. So the sack of Rome is something that kind of sped the progress of Mannerism and got people experimenting a bit more, but it was around a little bit before that, but it becomes dominant during this period of the late Renaissance. So really, besides the sack of Rome, the other question is what more can be done? Now, Raphael has painted some beautiful cherubs. I mean, I'm not going to try to compete with that, okay? That if I'm going to think, hey, Raphael, I can get you in a cherub contest. Okay, I'm going to lose that contest no matter how hard I try, because Raphael and Da Vinci and Michelangelo, these people were, they were good at what they did, at painting these idealized forms. And so this kind of perfection has already been reached. And so if we're going to try to compete with these artists, then going to distinguish ourselves, okay? So this younger generation of artists, they're thinking, I've got to do something different. So remember that for life, because if other people are doing it and they're doing it well, then you're going to have to figure out another angle if you want to be somebody. And that's what these Mannerist painters were doing, because other people had already perfected this idealized art. And so this forms, in some ways, some people have called it a silver age of Renaissance art. And this is very humanist in nature, because just like Latin literature, you've got the golden age of Latin literature under Augustus, and then you've got the silver age of Latin literature that follows, that is not as well known, but it's still good stuff, and it's still good in its own right. But, you know, Latin literature, the silver age stuff, when compared to the stuff at the time of Augustus, not quite there, and Mannerism is not something that gets as much attention as the art of the High Renaissance. So what is Mannerism? Now, this is one of those things that it's a term applied by historians, and so it's not like somebody's, oh, I'm a Mannerist painter or something like that. So, you know, what exactly does this mean? Why do we call it this? There are some people who have put together, you know, this is what it means. Maybe it's a combination, but is it in the manner of earlier and maybe better artists, in the manner of late Michelangelo? Because we're going to see how Michelangelo's later work is different from his earlier work. Or does it just mean in the modern manner, that I'm painting in this modern manner? And another thing about Mannerism is, if you think about this, while Renaissance art is beautiful, and the School of Athens is one of my favorite paintings, second favorite painting really, and Renaissance art, while very beautiful, it placed a lot of limitations on the artist's creativity, because it had to be of perfect proportions, it had to be idealized, it had to be completely balanced, and the perspective had to be perfect. So everything had to line up. There are all these rules, and rules can be somewhat constraining to someone who is creative. So when we look at Mannerist art, we see examples of artists choosing to exercise their creativity rather than just to mimic other artists and playing by these rules. So what I would say about the art of the High Renaissance, I would call this idealized nature, okay? Because when it comes down to it, it's not realism per se, because there's an idealism about it. These people that you see in High Renaissance art, these are not people that you just run into on the street, okay? These are idealized people. You see proportion, symmetry, grace, and stability. With Mannerism, I would call this augmented nature, because they are willing to portray some things beyond how they would appear in reality, and something that, you know, such as elongation. We're going to see a lot of elongated forms. We're going to see asymmetrical compositions. We will see tension and instability rather than grace and stability. So, you know, there is an emotional reaction is being sought, whereas that is really not a priority of Renaissance art. So let's go ahead and take a look at some late Michelangelo. Now, first of all, the Last Judgment, which is in the Sistine Chapel. It's behind the altar, but it's painted in a different style. Now, you can see that, okay, if somebody says the same guy painted the ceiling and painted the wall behind the altar, okay, I can go with that. But this is a later work, and of course, it's after the sack of Rome, after the High Renaissance, and Michelangelo is showing a willingness here to trade idealized beauty for emotion and shock value. When you look at this painting, you're not thinking that, oh, this is so beautiful, but there is a sense of grandeur and awe and, just fear that permeates this painting. This is something that the Italians at that time called terribilità. Now, I don't know, my Italian's not as great as MG's, but I appreciate the pronunciation help, MG, with that. Terribilità. Now, this is projecting this sense of grandeur. You know, it roughly translates to terror. And when you look at this painting, I mean, there is something of a terror here, but it's a sense of grandeur and awe. Now, we can see this in Michelangelo's High Renaissance work. So if we're taking a look at the creation of the sun and the moon and the plants here, we can see some of this grandeur, some of this terribilità. But we don't see it dominating, okay? So that is something that is really at the forefront of the Last Judgment, where it's just present in Michelangelo's early work. Now, I tell you, one of my students, she said during class, she said, "Oh, that's the sun and the moon, all right." And I just, I'm not laughing at my own joke, so that's okay, right? But I really, like, every once in a while, a student says something really funny that makes me laugh. And I just cannot get it out of my head when I look at this painting. That's the sun and the moon. All right, so there we go. Now, this, when you look at this, we're not laughing, all right? This is the damned soul. Now, notice that there's some elongation. You see agony on the face of this person who's going to hell. You see these demons, and they're very ugly. Now, also, note how the figures are not muscled in an idealized way. They're really over-muscled. They're just really, like, meaty, like they're on steroids or something like that. And so you don't think when you're looking at this, I'm looking at something beautiful, but I'm looking at something that makes me, like, not want to go to hell. And then we can see here Michelangelo's willingness to augment reality, that he's not just portraying people as they are, but he's thinking, let me be a little creative and let me portray St. Bartholomew, who was, according to Christian tradition, whipped to death. And so we see the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew, and that is the place in the painting that Michelangelo chose to put himself, which was not really unusual for Renaissance artists to appear in their own paintings, but my goodness, look at this. And you think, like, wow, what is Michelangelo saying about his own emotions and his own attitudes toward this painting? Because this painting was something that was very controversial and not well received when he painted it, because it violated a lot of conventions. I don't know if challenged is the right word, but it didn't go along with Catholic orthodoxy. It has a lot of pagan themes, such as you see the boat crossing the river Styx and that sort of thing. So it was heavily criticized, but Michelangelo really had decided, look, I'm Michelangelo, I'm going to do my own thing. And the same with his last works, which are displayed at a chapel in Vatican City, but really don't receive a lot of attention, even though I really like this one, The Conversion of Saul, 1545. Now, you look at this one and it's like, wow, there is no sense of proportion. This is just Michelangelo trying to portray this as he envisions it. And, I remember when I was growing up, it's like Saul's on the road to Damascus. There's his horse and he's falling off of it. But the thing is, I'd always kind of imagine, like, Jesus is a pretty, like, chill guy, like, kind of, maybe a hippie type. And, Saul's just on the road to Damascus, and, Jesus kind of looks out from behind the clouds and is like, hey, Saul, kind of curious. Why are you persecuting me, man? But that's not what's happening here, okay? Michelangelo is a really intense guy. And he's saying here, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Are you good? Like that Street Fighter 2. Like, I mean, Jesus is like, a video game character, which I hear there's some kind of game somewhere where, like, gods fight each other and Jesus is on it. I've never played it. But, wow. But there is not symmetry. There's not proportion, just shock and awe. And so this is, his work. Basically, this is how I want to portray it, and I don't give a darn about your conventions. And a very similar thing with the crucifixion of St. Peter, and interesting how Peter's just kind of like looking at you. I can't tell what's going on, it's pretty chaotic, and there's nothing balanced about it. Michelangelo's just like, look, here's how I envision it, here's how I want to do it, there. What you see is what you get. And as I continue this lecture, I'm going to talk about the work of Parmigianino and as well as El Greco. So if you want to, go ahead and go to the second part of this lecture so that we can see some more Mannerist work. It's always a pleasure.